The iron door screamed open, and the Lycan, Ilara, threw herself at Cain like a living hurricane, teeth bared, palms taloned into stone and blood. He tasted copper on the air and the old, bitter tang of fear as her claws slid across his forearm. For a terrible beat, he thought he would drown in the primal weight of it. Then she looked at him, really looked, and the ferocity folded into something raw, a small, wild face that trembled with the attempt not to remember. Her jaw worked. She made a sound that was half anger and half plea. And when he stepped back, not away from duty, but toward the part of himself that still believed in mercy, he felt the world tilt on a hinge he hadn't known he had left. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. Cain Moreau was paid to be hard. That was supposed to be the comfortable fiction of his life. A body for hire, a face that could be placed into any shadow and trusted to keep the quiet. Years of contracts taught him to keep his hands steady, his promises shorter than a blade, and his emotions sealed behind a ledger of debts. He had learned how to breathe through desperate things. Arson, witness removals, bloodletting favors for houses that dealt in teeth and old gold. And to leave the mess to the city. But House Voss purchased him like a precise instrument. They didn't want a monster caged. They wanted the illusion of terror maintained. They wanted a guardian who could be trusted to hold brutality while refusing to become it. Seraphine Voss had given him a ledger that was thicker than coin. On paper, Cain's job was child simple. Watch the Lycan in the cellar beneath the Voss estate. Make sure she never saw the moon. Ensure the wards held. Off paper, Seraphine held the only name that still mattered to him, his brother's, and the thin promise that the man's disappearance would stop if Cain obeyed. There are debts that sit under the skin like a second spine. And Cain wore Seraphine's with the same resigned tilt of his shoulders he used to hide fresh scars. The Voss estate sat like a dead star at the edge of the city's glass sheen, a patchwork of marble and older stone where polished corridors met runes carved into foundation bones. The cellar was a different world, low-ceilinged, damp, ringed in iron and ritual. Runes glowed in a blue light Seraphine allowed to be summoned, the kind that whispered of bargains sealed in old blood. It was meant to be an oubliette of myth, rumors fed to ravenous mouths of court gossip, yet the reality of Ilara turned the rumor into something that tasted like injustice on Cain's tongue. The first time he had seen her, she was not the myth. She was a woman with salt-rimmed lashes and a neck that still remembered the angles of laughter. Even when she tacked against the iron like a trapped thing, the curve of her throat betrayed a softness he'd been trained to ignore. The moonstone, a flat orb the size of a thumb embedded at the base of her spine, threw back the cellar light in a slow, cruel pulse. Chains of braided silver and blood threaded the stone into the mortar, a latticework of magic that hummed whenever the wards were tested. The blood thread in the walls murmured like a fevered vein. Every spell in that room had been designed to gasp life into fear and breathe out memory. "Keep her from the moon," Seraphine had said when she handed him the contract. Her voice was the sound of ice sliding across a funeral plate. Graceful, soundless, inevitable. You watch the Voss property, you keep your hands clean, and you keep her bound. Do that, and I will answer what you ask. Cain had wanted to laugh once when she offered the name of his brother like a trinket. as if a single name could fix the slow, gnawing absence that had hollowed him since the night they'd taken their brother on an errand that never returned. Instead, he signed. People like him accepted bargains with fewer illusions. He was not naive about Seraphine's teeth. The Voss lineage had been hawking leverage since before Cain's grandfather learned to run. But the raw fact of hope, no matter how brittle, had been enough to buckle his will. Ilara had been queen once. That lodged inside him like a splinter of something shameful. In the stories he had heard traveling through the underworld, queens were rare, and to take one and make her a cautionary tale was both signature Voss and sacrilege to the natural order. Her pack's banners had once been stitched with laughter and wolf song. Now she was an exhibit, the headlining horror when the vampire court wanted to remind Pax who held the leash. On his first night alone with her, he learned how they made fear into a discipline. The manacles tightened at the wrong sound, a laugh in the next room, boots on the stone, and Ilara's body reacted with animal grace, a coiled thing ready to leap. But in the pauses between those tensions, she slept like someone who had been hollowed out and refilled with ash. Her breathing became a small tide you could time with the second hand on a clock. A remnant flash of humanity lived behind her eyes. At moments, when Cain moved the meager food he was allowed to slide through the hatch, she would touch the bread as if memorizing a language she had forgotten. "You shouldn't look at me like that," she rasped once, when the wards hummed low and the cellar's magic tried to whisper away the memory in Ilara's skull. Her voice, when she wasn't snarling, was rough and surprising, like a chord struck on a stone you'd never thought could play music. "The moon is a thief. It steals faces." "I didn't come to steal anything," Cain said. He had meant to hold to his distance, to catalog the notes of her aggression for Seraphine, to be a good instrument of the house. But there are contracts you sign with your hands, and others you sign with the parts of yourself that ache when someone else is broken. He had served enough masters to know which bargains transformed men. This one had a thin seam that tugged at something like pity. She laughed then, soft, brittle, and the sound fractured into something that might have been a name. "Cain," she breathed, pulling the syllable like a memory from behind a curtain. The name hit him like a brand he had forgotten he bore. He didn't speak his own name aloud often. Names had weight in their world. He felt it settle against his ribs, a new burden that flickered with dangerous electricity. A private reckoning that the woman in the cellar knew who he was. "Don't reach for it," she warned, eyes folding shut. "Names are anchors. They pull you into storms." "Neither of us has been allowed to stay ashore," he told her. He moved the bread closer, then farther, then settled with the indifferent ritual of closing the hatch. The ledger between him and Seraphine had a line item for obedience, another for failure. Everything else, every hesitation, every undesired tenderness, was uncounted. He could feel the list of things he had given up adding itself like a tally against his bones. Outside the cellar, the city shimmered with a different hunger. The glass towers reflected the sky and hid bone and rot beneath their shine. Packs whispered in alleyways, courting unrest. Vampire houses polished their predatory reputations with estates like Voss. The Voss's display of the savage Lycan had been a calculated lie to keep those murmurs from becoming war. House Voss's threat was not merely to intimidate, it was to demonstrate the cost of defiance, to take a queen and make her a ghost story to scare insurgent packs into obedience. Cain understood the ledger of fear better than most. He'd watched whole families fold under similar pressures, betting survival against soul. In the first days, Cain kept to the terms. He monitored the wards, reported minor disturbances, and catalogued Ilara's movements with a brutality of professionalism that should have left him untouched. Instead, each instance of her fragility opened a map of new obligations he had not meant to draw. He began to read the cadence of her sleep, the tiny way her hands curled when she dreamed of rivers, and the hairline fracture of a smile when he spoke the name of a town he had thought only pack ears would know. He told himself the only danger was to keep feeling. Feeling diluted resolve. It sapped the currency of the contract. Still, alone in the cellar's dim after Seraphine's carriage had sighed away, Cain sat on the cold stone and let his shoulder rest near the breathing of a woman the world would call a savage. The contract weighed like a noose around his throat, but there was a different weight settling on his chest, something fierce and accusatory, like truth coming home. "You keep looking at me like there's an answer in your eyes," Elara muttered the third night when the wards had eased into a low hum and the moon outside was a pale coin. "Perhaps," Cain said, "or perhaps I sent myself." Her laugh this time was less brittle, edged with a softness he hadn't expected. "Maybe we'll both be bargains then," she said. "Two things sold for the price of not losing more." He remembered his brother's laugh then, how it used to break the circuits of his stern father, and something in the memory unraveled the last of his practiced hardness. There are bargains men make to save their own souls. There are bargains they make that cost them pieces they can't afford to lose. Cain had stepped into Seraphine's ledger thinking the arithmetic would be simple. Now, in the cellar's borrowed night, he saw the sum growing more complicated. A queen turned savage, a man who had sold his loyalty for a name, and a city that would not stop bleeding until someone broke the rules. The first act closed not with a quiet, but with a dilemma that burned in Cain like frostbite. Obey Seraphine and possibly reclaim the only family he had left, or defy her and risk everything for a woman who might be more dangerous than the house she defied. Between those two choices, the ledger of his life began to rattle, a dangerous arithmetic neither coin nor oath could fully resolve. Cain woke before the cellar's single lamp most mornings, the hush that prefaced dawn settling like a careful hand across his shoulders. It was easier to be a machine in those small hours. Check the seals, run the ward's diagnostics, log the vibrations that meant a carriage or a clandestine visitor. But machines don't listen to a woman breathe, to the soft click her teeth made when she arranged her memories into nightmares. Cain learned to time his steps to the rhythm of Elara's rest. If he moved like a ghost and kept his lantern low, the rust in her chest never rose to howl. The first rule he broke was small and idiotic. He brought her real bread. The Voss kitchens rationed him the crusts they could afford to waste, neatly wrapped in whispers of blood that meant the inventory would always outbalance the appetite. But there was a bakery 2 blocks from the estate, owned by a woman who covenanted with no house and owed Cain a favor for a debt he had quietly erased years before. He traded the favor for a warm loaf wrapped in linen, no wards, no spice, just bread that steam softened the crust and smelled like mornings that hadn't been sold. When Cain slid the hatch open that night and offered the bread on a palm calloused from rope and cold, Elara's hand closed around it as if it might vanish. She didn't notice the flour dust that freckled her knuckles until she lifted them to her face and inhaled like she had discovered rain. The look that flared across her was not hunger, it was recognition. She had been taught to believe that comfort was a baited hook. For the first breath in a long while, she allowed herself to be wrong. "Why do you do that?" she asked after the bread, voice thinner than the metal grate between them. "Why give me kindness you won't take from the ledger?" Cain crouched, keeping his profile dull so the lamplight would not catch the lines of his face. "Because somebody taught me once that you don't have to always be sold. Sometimes you save something for the poor parts of the city." She chewed slowly, eyes never leaving his. "Were you ever poor?" "A long time ago." He did not elaborate. The confession of a gutter and the confession of a man who let a pack die were different weights, and he carried the latter like a leaded vest he could not remove. And once, I watched an alpha drown because I followed orders that smelled like sense at the time. I still wake to him slipping away in the dark. That's the kind of debt that has teeth." Her gaze sharpened. Ilara's savagery was not only fangs and flair, it held a dangerous lucidity that surfaced in moments when the stone cleared of magic. "You could have done more," she said quietly. "You could have pulled him up." Cain flinched as if struck. He'd rehearsed the memory into a script, an errand that turned, a convoy ambushed, a brother taken or lost, and a choice he had made to survive by leaving a man behind. The truth was uglier. He had miscalculated, trusted the wrong map, then told himself survival was pragmatic. Shame had hollowed him. He had spent years quantifying his mistakes into contracts and counting on the illusion that distance made them lesser. "I did what I could," he said, the lie tasting of rust. "I tried." Ilara's fingers folded around the bread until the paper creased. "You tried like the world expects men to try. You kept breathing and did nothing heroic." "It wasn't nothing," Cain snapped before he could stop himself. The heat of an argument cut through his practiced numbness like sudden sun. "And it wasn't only cowardice. Sometimes," he let the words out in thinner slices than confession, "sometimes people survive because others have to. I made a choice." Her eyes darkened. For a moment, she looked like a queen making judgment, the predator behind the training of a life. And something in Cain's jaw unclenched. The first chink in his armor came not from her claws, but from the way she regarded him like a mirror with edges. "But you could be more," Ilara said after a long silence, which was not a challenge so much as a promise mouthed under her breath. "You could do the thing that scares you." That night, his hands trembled when he slid the Voss ledger into his coat pocket and walked into the estate's shadowed periphery. He had set rules for himself, no favors that would break the letter of the contract. But the ledger that mattered now was the one in his stomach, where every time he tried to feed himself, blame returned with bread. He had been paid to be hard, but Ilara's small, stubborn softness made hardness a brittle armor. The second transgression was not a small. Ilara was bound to the cellar's magical rhythm. The moonstone pulsed with phases like a heartbeat borrowed from some thief. Seraphine's wards hummed higher on nights when the moon tilted like a blade over the estate, and Cain answered the house's calls with the dutiful cold of a man used to being watched. But on a night when the moon was a thin coin, Ilara's memories slipped like fingernails from the grip of the spell. She whispered fragments, songs, names, a child's laugh. And Cain listened until the sound felt like a prayer. "Tell me about your pack," he said, in the spaces where her sentences unplugged. He had no business knowing about banners and rivers and the way her pack used to raise their voices together, but the sound of her recalling her people needed a witness. There is a cruelty in enforced forgetting. It had been Seraphine's tool to shame and disarm. To give Ilara audience was treasonous in its gentleness. Ilara rested her forehead against the iron grate and hummed a note that was not a song so much as a thread. "We were 5, she said, and an old oak marked the boundary of our land. My son," her throat closed. "He was small then. He loved the bloom of marsh marigold." Cain felt the world sharpen. A child's laugh had no business in a vampire cellar except as collateral. The Voss had taken a queen and turned her into spectacle. If they had taken a son too, then the ledger of evil had teeth deeper than he had expected. He remembered Seraphine's calm voice offering a name for his brother. Now he wondered if she had traded more than a promise. "Where is he?" Cain asked, the question too simple and the stakes unmoored. Ilara's hand stilled where she had been tracing a rune along the wall, and for a breath her expression collapsed into pure, reachable grief. "I don't know. It glitches. Sometimes I get a memory of a river, and sometimes I get a smell of iron, and sometimes—" She stopped, hands clenching into the fuzz of her blanket. "Sometimes I think they told me he drowned to keep me obedient." The cellar's lamp flickered as if in response to the shape of that sentence. The thought of Seraphine Voss manufacturing a child's erasure to maintain dominion was the kind of cruelty Cain had written off to rumor and market. But rumor hardened into law when its rightness had been proven by violence. His fingers closed into a fist so tight his knuckles paled. "You don't know," he said, more to steady the room than to comfort. "But you're not alone in wanting to find him." Ilara's laugh was dry as a bone. "You look like you mean that." "I do," Cain said, and the admission landed in his chest like a seed. He did not know if it could grow into anything but regret, but he had promised himself to keep doing things he thought might be more than survival. The promise to Seraphine burned at the back of his mind. The name of his brother hovered like a coin he still had not been paid. He had come to the cellar a mercenary with a contract. Now, leaning against iron and listening to the crack of someone else's heart, he felt less like a skill and more like a choice. The taste of rebellion in his mouth was sudden and metallic. Cain began to do things that could be rationalized in a ledger, but that felt like kindness. He smuggled herbs for Ilara's wounds, a sliver of candle wax that could be used to smooth the moonstone's sharper edges, a scrap of cloth stolen from a guest's cloak so she could arrange her hair without scratching the wound the chains made. Each small theft knit him closer to a moral fault line he had thought had been cemented with years of practice. Word traveled differently down in the city's older veins. A pack scout, a wiry man named Wren, with a history of getting bitten by consequences and learning to live with the scars, found Cain one night near the bakery and approached like a shadow with its own appetite. "You're the guard," Wren said bluntly, eyes like old pennies catching light. "They say Voss keeps a queen under glass. I thought it was propaganda." Cain wiped the flour off his fingers and did not answer. The packs had their own network of rumor, and Wren's presence was proof that the cellar's story had escaped the Voss walls. The more people knew, the more likely it was that the court's theatrics would ignite the tinder Cain had been paid to smother. "We don't want a war," Wren continued in a low voice. "But queens are not for trophies. If it comes out that Seraphine has been—" "You're the one who could start it," Cain said. The bitter truth was that he had been hired to prevent the very escalation Wren hinted at. You go stirring tongues in markets and you'll get people killed. Wren's jaw twitched. And sitting still gets people killed quietly, which is worse. They stood there with the bakery's warm smell between them, two men who had made a living counting losses. Outside the Voss walls, the city breathed danger like it always had. Inside, threats were bespoke and groomed. Cain's contract demanded obedience. His conscience demanded repair. Each demanded payment in different currencies. "Tell your people to hold," Cain said at last. "For now." Wren's laugh was brittle. "For now? That is a short term." "It might be enough," Cain said. He believed this for reasons he could not wholly justify. The longer secrets stayed buried, the more possibility there was to unearth them with the right leverage. But he also knew the truth. Secrets only slept for so long. A provocation, a misstep, a moonlit night, any of them could break the thin peace. When Seraphine called, her voice was a cool dispatch delivered through the estate's private line. "You are exceeding your remit," she said, calm as a blade wrapped in satin. Cain stiffened. "I'm following orders." "Do not test me, Cain," Seraphine warned. "You know what I hold. I can make all your gains evaporate. Let your brother's name be a rumor of regret. Continue to be sentimental, and I'll make you understand what real debt looks like." For a beat, the world bent on an axis he had been keeping asunder. He thought of the name she had offered like a coin. He thought of his brother's missing laugh. He had traded his loyalty for that name. Seraphine's leverage was not only legal, it was intimate. She could call in favors that would make him blink his last. "I will not disobey," Cain said, each word measured. He was trying to keep the Voss house's power at arm's length, tempering rebellion with the calculus of survival. Good. Her words iced over like frost on glass. Remember your place. After the call ended, the protective armor Cain wore cracked in a way that felt almost human. He had just lied to the woman who could burn him for more than his transgressions. He'd told her he would obey, while quietly shelving his obedience in the dark. It was an elegant, dangerous dance. One misstep and the music would stop and reveal all of his faults. In the cellar, Ilara watched him as if she had been reading his face for weeks. "She will hurt you with that ledger," she said quietly. "She will add pages to it and keep them in a safe." Cain forced a smile that tasted of iron and dust. "What would you have me do?" he asked. Whenever he asked the question, the world offered its usual options: obedience, which might buy him his brother's name; defiance, which would cost everything; or a slow erosion that tried to build a third way between the two. "Do the thing that scares you," she repeated, softer this time, as if stating a magic word. "Pay the price so someone else can breathe." Her words lingered like smoke. They were a promise he could not cash in yet, but they settled like kindling. For the first time since he'd taken Seraphine's contract, Cain imagined a different sum of debts and payments, one where a queen could be freed without trading his family for a figment. The push and pull of two lives, one kept by ledger, one kept by chain, accelerated. He found himself lying awake in the nights between, not because of the fear of Seraphine's retribution, but because he was starting to imagine the taste of rebellion, sharper and stranger than had expected. He kept looking at the moon through the thin slice of sky above the estate, measuring it like a bomb that ticked with the city's breaths. And Ilara, when she was lucid, began to teach him things a queen remembers, even when memory is a war. She hummed the words of a lullaby she whispered to a child he might have once known. She drew a crude map on the cellar wall with her finger, rivers, an oak, a pax ring, and Cain traced it with his own thumb, as if memorizing a route out of the estate could be the outline of a plan. Their closeness was a dangerous confluence of need and growing tenderness. Cain guarded her body with the knowledge of a man who could be bought by threats. He also began to guard the small sanctities of her person, the way she pressed her palm to a rune as if coaxing memory, the way her fingers twined in sleep. He told himself he was doing what any decent soldier might do for an innocent captive, but the soldier had already been corrupted by years of compromise. The truth was less noble. He found himself keeping secrets from the ledger, and those secrets were beginning to feel like a home. The emotional pull tightened with every stolen kindness. Ilara responded in a cataclysm of small confessions. She gave him more than scraps. She told him of nights when she had stood at the border of a pack and thought of gravity, of her hands scooping children from mud, of how a crown had once fit her like a promise. She also opened a wound Cain had not known he carried, by humming the name of his brother once, as if reciting a dead language. "Cain," she said one night, and the syllable fell between them like a benediction. "You keep your face like a coin you don't plan to spend. When you touch me, you look like you'll break." He reached for her hand through the grate, a contact so small it felt like an act of violence to the rules he had been taught and seduced by. "And when I look at you, I worry I'll find the man I was who left people behind." Ilara's fingers tightened. "If you are that man, then be honest with the rest of your life that you will try to change him." They were both students of conditional survival. Neither was sure how to be brave in a world that sold courage. But in the dark of the cellar, amid the hum of the wards and the distant watch of glass towers, Their small rebellions knit into something precarious. Each tender theft, each admission unshielded by ledger, compounded until Cain could no longer pretend he was only protecting himself. Outside, the city shifted. Pacts tested boundaries, whispers thickened into threats, and the vampire court polished its teeth. Inside the Voss estate, Seraphine watched with a patience that was surgical. She tightened the threads of her trap subtly, an extra watcher here, a lessening of rations there, testing the mettle of Cain's resolve. The house wanted to see whether fear could still be manufactured into loyalty. Cain felt watched and watched himself being watched. He strained against the pressure like someone trying to breathe under shallow water. The choices ahead were beginning to calcify into an impossible geometry. Every small kindness made the ledger demand a greater price. Every gesture of defiance set Seraphine's patience into a dangerous countdown. And Alara, fragile, fierce, and painfully alive, kept pulling him toward a line he had sworn not to cross. Tonight, as the moon hung like a single watching eye and the city thrummed with restless life, Cain made a choice he could not yet explain except to say that it felt inevitable. He would keep the contract and watch the ledger for now. He would smuggle warmth and memory and small comforts. He would be careful, but within the careful, he would begin to bargain with a hope he had not dared to spend, that a queen, a man, and a missing child could be enough to make the city reconsider the prices it charged. The tug between duty and desire had become a living thing, and it wanted very much to be fed. The next morning, the cellar smelled of rain, even though the sky over the estate had been a hard, dry blue. Alara was restless, pacing the ring of stone in a way that shredded the thin piece Cain had stitched. She moved like a tide negotiating rocks, each step measured, each turn a small rebellion. He watched her through the slatted hatch as he logged the rune readings on his pad, numbers and idle rituals that, on paper, made him a faithful soldier. His hands were steady, but his chest felt as if it carried a wound he could not staunch. When Seraphine's carriage rolled up the drive mid-afternoon, it was an announceable thing. The estate did not entertain surprise. Her arrival brought with it the kind of cold that had nothing to do with weather, the kind that could make a man confess to crimes he had not yet committed. Cain met her in the corridor where the walls were papered in trophies and treaties, photographs of bargains, teeth, signed names in inks that tasted of ancient promises. Seraphine did not smile. She never smiled in a way that invited confession. Instead, she smiled as if demonstrating the correct angle of teeth for someone about to be owned. "You've made yourself useful," she said, and her eyes slid to his forearm where the mark of Elara's claws still drew pale crescents. The compliment was a blade wrapped in velvet. But use is different from affection. Cain kept his posture like a man practicing a line. "I keep the cellar intact." Indeed, she stepped closer. The scent of her was a careful mixture of jasmine and old money. "You also have made yourself inventive. Rations out of the kitchens displaced, favors borrowed, colloquiums with the packs." She pronounced the last as if tasting a bad spice. Inventive is a kind word. Simple obedience would have sufficed. He let silence answer. She had been watching him for longer than he'd realized. The Voss had ways of noticing the small anomalies that spell betrayal. "Do you know what will happen if your creativity grows into conspiracy?" Seraphine asked conversationally, like a cat explaining gravity to a fledgling mouse. "I could name you a traitor, Cain. I could remind the city that the man who abandoned a Pax Alpha would be an example we set in stone." Cain's muscles tightened. He felt the old ghost of shame like a live ember being pressed against scar tissue. The past he had tried to file away, his choices on that blood-soaked night, was a ledger Seraphine could reopen at pleasure. "Not everything that happens is yours to solve," she continued, words precise, slow. "Sometimes people are meant to be silent monuments. You understand monuments." "I understand what keeps people alive," Cain said. It was a taut retort meant to deflect. "You could have taken more than a queen, Seraphine. You could have made silence permanent. Instead, you chose spectacle." Her smile sharpened. "A queen who becomes a cautionary tale teaches obedience. A missing child teaches annihilation, all useful to keep packs placated." She leaned in oracularly. "But I did not bargain to be cruel only for cruelty's sake. I am a house that calculates. You will not derail me." "The boy," Cain started before he could stop himself, voice low and urgent. "If you took him—" Seraphine's expression didn't change, and the pause that followed was a scalpel. "I took many things, Mr. Moreau. I keep what sustains my house." She tapped the side of Cain's jaw with a gloved finger, as if testing for a pulse. "You are sentimental about things other people prize. That is either your greatest fault or your greatest weapon." When he left her, he carried more than the weight of the estate's cold approval. He carried an image she had not anticipated producing. In the private pocket of her glove, Seraphine had shown him a scrap of paper folded into a narrow, careful shape. Under police light, it might have been nothing, a child's drawing, the smear of a thumb. But in the way she held it like evidence, she had been making a transaction. That night, when he slid the bakery bread through the hatch and watched Ilara's fingers close around it like a benediction, he lied to himself and to her. "Seraphine's tightened the rationing," he said. "She thinks we're becoming complacent." "Complacent?" Ilara scoffed, but her hands had begun to tremble. The moonstone's pulse was stronger that evening, a dull thudding that made the cellar floor vibrate like a heart on the verge of announcement. "She will tighten what she can. That is all the houses know." "You miss things," Cain admitted, before he could stop himself. Confessions had become accidents between them, small fissures widening under the strain of truth. "She showed me something today. She likes to demonstrate control." Ilara's head lowered. Her shoulders did something small and fatal. She folded, a map of grief unrolled. "Did she show you? Was she—" "You didn't see it," Cain said, and the words came sharp. "She had a letter. She said it was proof. She said proof keeps people obedient." He could hardly look at her when he said it. The image of Seraphine's gloved hand closing around the folded scrap of paper burned behind his eyelids. "You've seen a letter and not told me?" Ilara's voice broke like thin glass. Her fierce composure shattered into the brittle shards of someone who had been learning to trust the wrong man at the wrong moment. Did she tell you what it said?" "No," he said, but the answer was not the sanctuary he hoped for. It was an omission that felt like betrayal. He realized in the hollow of his chest that he had been keeping two ledgers, one in which he performed loyalty, and another in which he hid small transgressions of mercy. Ilara had been the unintended recipient of the latter. He had been telling Seraphine what she needed while keeping the edges of rebellion a secret, and now that secrecy had a face that looked like hurt. "You lied to me," she whispered, and it was not accusation as much as sorrow aired like a wound. "You promised me you would be honest. You promised." "I wasn't lying at first," Cain said, fumbling for the sincerity he had kept like a hidden coin. "She wanted me to feel watched, to be manageable. She offered me the name I came for as payment for obedience. I thought—" He did not finish. How could he explain the arithmetic that had decided some names were worth more than the safety of someone breathing in a cellar? How could he make her see a debt that tasted like hope? Her face hardened, the way steel hardens when plunged into cold. "You took a bargain for a name and kept that name like a talisman. How can I believe anything else you say?" Kane's chest threatened to cave in. The ledger he had meant to keep closed now had a leak that flooded the room. He had been trying to buy back a family with obedience, only to learn obedience could be a currency Seraphine spent to buy cruelty. "I'm trying to get your son back," he said quietly, and the words landed like a plea. "I'm trying to get your freedom." "Trying." Elara's laugh was a dry wind. "Try as you like. But you keep secrets. You save pennies and call it piety. You keep my truths in your pockets like coins you won't spend." Rage, edged with fear, flashed across her face. The moonstone pulsed hard enough that the chains clinked, a sound that made Kane flinch. There was a dangerous clarity in her eyes now, savage and queen-like at once, and Kane felt his own resolve splinter. He had been appointed guardian of a monster, and had fallen in love with the monster's pause between breath and hunger. Now the thing that had bound them, trust, was fraying. Their quarrel was not dramatic in the way of thrown objects. Instead, it was small and sharp, the kind that cut more deeply precisely because the wound was intimate. She accused him of bargaining with her life. He defended himself with explanations that sounded thin. In the end, she turned away from him, pressing a palm to the iron as if feeling the contour of invisible bars, and he stood on the other side of the hatch like a man who had been told he was both jailer and lover and could not reconcile the two. That night, Seraphine called again, and this time Kane answered with the mechanical steadiness of someone who decided to pretend he was still a man of the ledger. "You are slowing," she said. "Messenger, Wren, yes, has been asking questions. Your little network makes noise." "It isn't for war," Kane lied. If Seraphine sensed his duplicity, she gave no sign. "No, you lie well," she answered simply. "But lies explode. People get hurt when illusions fail. You know the cost." She paused. For a moment, something like pity, so thin it might have been another weapon, shivered between her syllables. "I will give you one last chance to do this cleanly. Hand over your friend Wren and any pacts you have entertained. Return to the obedience you promised, and you will have the name you seek. Betray me, and I will make the ledger of your life public." Kane's throat closed. The name of his brother hung there like a coin he would give to save himself, or like a promise he would break to keep someone else alive. Seraphine had given him a terrible clarity with that offer. Betray the pack and buy his family, or refuse and risk everything for a woman who might never trust him again. He thought of Elara's face when she learned he had not told her about the letter, and of the child's laugh she had named like a treasure. He thought of the ledger that had made him a man, and the small rebellions that had hollowed it. The choice was no longer a simple arithmetic of survival and payment. It was a geometry of pain. Later, in the cellar's dim, Elara pressed her forehead against the iron again and whispered something that sounded like prayer or accusation. "If you keep a name and lose who you are, what use is the name at all?" Kane could not answer. He had been paid to be hard, and in the end, hardness had been a currency Seraphine knew how to spend. The thing he had been buying, the possibility of retrieval, of family, had become a measure against his tenderness, and tenderness had a way of bending the strongest men until they broke. That night, Kane lay awake with Seraphine's ultimatum like a weight on his sternum. The city outside held its usual noises, distant voices, the clack of a carriage, the low roil of a pack forming a storm in the wrong hands. Inside, Elara dreamed in fractured lulls, murmuring a child's name that might be true. The ledger in Kane's pocket had never felt heavier. By dawn, he had decided something terrifying and irrevocable. He could no longer be both Seraphine's obedient instrument and Ilara's shelter. The choice would cost him his brother's name, perhaps everything, his life, his reputation, the fragile trust he'd begun to weave. But Cain's hands were shaking with the kind of certainty that comes right before a man steps off a ledge. He gathered the small things he had stolen, a scrap of cloth perfumed with a baker's care, an herb tied in linen, and the Voss ledger he'd signed, and slid through corridors that smelled like old treaties. He did not know yet how he would pay the price. He only knew he could not continue to be the man who kept a queen a secret while keeping names like currency. The city outside stretched like a potential war in the early light. The moon was a promise and a threat. Seraphine had drawn her line in the ledger. Cain was about to draw his in blood. Cain moved like a man answering a summoned reckoning. The Voss corridors were quieter at dawn. Servants still smelled of sleep and perfumed worry, and the house's bones held the echoes of bargaining. He wrapped the stolen cloth around his knuckles and felt the small paper weight of the ledger in his pocket, the contract whose signatures had bought him into this corruption. He did not bother to make a plan. Plans belonged to men who expected to survive their own courage. This was not a plan. It was a plunge. The cellar hatch had a habit of speaking when opened too quickly. Tonight, it sighed with an intimate complaint. Ilara stirred immediately, the moonstone at her spine thudding like a drum gone mad. She lunged for the grate as Cain knelt and pressed his forehead to the cold iron between them. "Cain," she breathed, and her voice was a raw thing he wanted to hold and never let break. "You cannot." "I know," he said. He slid the scrap of bread across to her with fingers that had steadied under more lethal lights. "When I take it, you will howl. When I touch the stone, I will know what it means. I am not asking for forgiveness." Her hand closed on the bread and trembled. "You promised," she said, "not as reproach, but as an anchor." "I promise nothing but this," Cain whispered. "I will not let her keep you as a lesson." She watched him with the calm of someone who had been betrayed by power enough times to know the taste in a man's mouth before it could be hidden. The moonstone pulsed. The chains that braided into the mortar seemed to hum like a hive. Cain tested the warding rune again with the charm Ilara had taught him in a whisper, a paltry thing learned from the edges of her memory. It stung the way first lies hurt. The room answered with a shiver. He had no right to be surprised by the violence of Seraphine's design. The moonstone was not a jewel. It was a battery of enforced hunger, a magician's engine that fed off the blood thread in the walls. To remove it would require a counter-ritual, a theft of enchantment rather than coin, salt, a child's song, and the willingness to be marked. He had once apprenticed with a fence who trafficked in illicit spells, had once watched a witch bind a man's debt into his skin with a needle. The knowledge was thin and dangerous. It was enough. "When you take it," Ilara said, "it will scream, not like a beast, like a memory that wants to live." "Then it will be heard," Cain said. He moved faster than he thought he could. He slid through the latticework of wards, fingers tracing runes that had been carved by intention and cruelty. Somewhere above, servants shifted and a carriage wheel squealed. Seraphine's patience was a pressure that made his teeth ache. He found the moonstone by touch before he could make it out by sight. The stone had a heat like old anger, warm and migratory. It hung a thumb's width from her spine, threaded with silver and blood, its surface catching the cellar's meager light and throwing it back like accusation. The counterchant came out wrong on the first try, a thrash of borrowed language. The stone flared, and Ilara cried out, a sound that was part animal and part woman. Cain gripped the chains and felt them bite into his palms. The metal tasted of Voss and of old promises. It thrummed with the lives it had stolen. He pressed his forehead to her shoulder and let her feel the steadiness of a hand that had been taught to hold recoil. Footsteps thundered above. Someone had betrayed the quiet. "Seraphine," Cain said into Ilara's hair, because the name itself needed to be spoken aloud like a spell. "Hold on to me." She clawed at the iron grate, nails scraping stone, and then stopped when he put one palm at the base of the moonstone and the other at her wrist. He began the chant again, slower, letting the words gather like rain. The moonstone kicked back with a pressure that felt like drowning. It tugged at Cain's marrow, fishing for the bone of him. He answered with his own currency, blood. He slid his palm with a small, hidden blade and fed the rune with what he had, his own dark, salted life. That is the nature of certain bargains. Some currencies take what they need and leave the debtor altered. The blood licked the rune, and the stone responded with a shriek like metal under winter wind. The cellar lamps guttered. The chains shook loose a hair's breadth. For one terrible, exultant moment, Cain tasted something else on his tongue beneath the iron, wolf amber, a warmth that was not his and yet fit like a new skin. Above, the door slammed as Seraphine's voice filled the corridors, crisp and destructive. "Cain, cease this madness and give me my property." "You sold it," he laughed, a sound half defiant and half animal. "You sold a queen to keep your house comfortable." Footsteps came down the stairs, a flock of black boots. Seraphine materialized in the hatch's gap as if she'd been summoned by the same thrill he had felt, the possibility of final ownership over a man. She stood there, cloaked in silk and calm rage, the ledger of her power folded into the curve of her smile. "You will regret this," she promised, but there was no patronizing warmth in it. It was the promise of a hurricane. "Maybe," Cain said. He did not let go of the moonstone. He felt the stone's pulse match the hammer of his blood. There was a moment when he saw the ledger and Seraphine's gloved hand in the same room, and realized he had already spent his last coin. Seraphine moved like a shadow with teeth. Two guards surged around her, blades flicking. Ren's silhouette appeared beside them, where he had promised to stand watch, but now stood between Cain and the door. He had made his choice alongside Cain: silent complicity in rebellion, or the price of a life counted in teeth. Ren's eyes were wet with a courage that frightened even Cain. "Release her and step aside," Seraphine ordered. Her voice threaded the air with menace. "Surrender the boy's letter and the name, or the city will learn what becomes of those who defy us." Cain tightened his hand until his knuckles burned. He could hand over the ledger, the name, the last scrap of his family in exchange for safety. He could barter another tragedy into the balance and live with the emptiness. He thought of Elara's son, if Seraphine had indeed taken him, and the way the child's laugh had haunted her dreams. He could not countenance another theft of a child's life in the name of survival. "I'll give you nothing," Cain said, and his voice was the slow, terrible cold of a man who had been broken enough to know his thresholds. "You will not have her." Then Seraphine did the thing she had always kept as an ultimate. She raised a hand, and a sigil, the house's brand, flared to life on her palm. The air thinned. Magic older than Cain's regrets answered her call. The cellar's walls shuddered. She intended to take the stone by force of law and sorcery, to rebind it with a terror that would make Cain's revolt a cautionary tale. Cain's next move was less a choice than surrender to the part of him that had been waiting to be remade. He gripped the moonstone and wrenched. It screamed, an animal sound and a memory and a bell tolling at once. The chains gave with a resisting cry. He felt the stone tear loose, and with it a lash of something ancient, a surge of wolf heat that braided itself into his bones. Pain was a language he understood well. The moonstone bit his palm and sank tendrils into his skin as if it had been waiting for a host. He felt the world tilt under him, sensations fracturing into heightened edges, the scent of iron like a child's name, the taste of fear, the sweetness of Alara's breath. He did not know if the change would kill him or make him beautiful in an animal's way. All he knew was that to free her meant exposing himself to a forever he did not yet comprehend. Seraphine's spell hit him like winter wind, and ash exploded from her sigil. The guards lunged. Cain roared, not human or wolf or quite anything polite, and pushed. A blade sliced his shoulder. Ren took a stab meant for him and staggered. Ilara, freed of the moonstone's guidance, collapsed into the stone floor and then rose with a terrible grace, eyes the color of river stones and hunger and recognition braided together. She lunged for Seraphine with claws that had not been hers by right but were now whole by will. Sparks of enchanted law tried to bind them both, the cellar filled with the stench of ozone and old coin. Cain knat Seraphine blade with fist, and for a breath the violence of his past caught like flint. He felt something rip open inside him, an animal shudder, and with it came strength and a wild sorrow that was not mere survival. In the chaos, Seraphine faltered, the certainty she carried shredded by the rawness of two people refusing to be led like sheep to her altars. Ilara tore Seraphine's sleeve with a cascade of fury, and in that moment Seraphine lost her posture. She had never expected people to value each other over the comfort of her house. She had accounted for fear, for silence, for bargains. She had not accounted for a man who would give the last coin of his family to buy another life. When the last sigil sputtered and the guards found themselves clumped and indecisive, Cain collapsed beside Ilara, chest heaving. The moonstone lay on the ground between them, dull and useless without the chains and the ritual that fed it. It was a stone in a room where a queen lay breathing again. They both bore injuries. Cain's shoulder bled, and a new ache threaded through his bones where something unfamiliar had paid rent. Ilara's wrists were bruised and raw from years of bondage, and her eyes held a bewildered wonder like a newborn seeing sky. Ren was propped against the wall, alive but pale as old parchment. The world beyond the hatch had howled. Someone had already begun to run. Seraphine stood in the doorway, silk ruined, and anger even more ruinous. She looked not like a defeated foe, but like a god asking why its worship had been stopped. Her face was a ledger of loss. "You will die for this," she intoned, but there was no triumph in it. There was only a cold, clinical grief at the loss of a power shed deemed absolute. Cain laughed, an ugly, shaking thing that had the edges of triumph and the ash of what he had lost. "Maybe," he said, "but I could not sell her life for the name of a brother." Ilara touched his face then, palms sure and gentle, and for a heartbeat the cellar became less like a prison and more like a wound being stitched with human hands. Her touch was cool with the perfume of shore and wildness, and the kind of fierce tenderness that makes men confess sins before they are asked. "I remember rivers," she whispered. "I remember a boy with marsh marigolds. I remember a man named Cain who would not be bought." Cain's chest uncoiled like a man letting air back into a room he'd been holding his breath in for decades. He had not saved everything. He had not even saved himself from change. But as Ilara's fingers traced the line of a new scar that marked his wrist, an ichor in the shape of a fang that had not been there before, he felt something steadier than the ledger settle under his ribs, a claim that was not written on paper, but registered in bone. They had broken Seraphine's theater, and in doing so, they had remade themselves. War wounds braided with animal heat, promises remade in the dirt and salt of a small rebellion. Cain had traded the currency of a name for the life of a woman who had once worn a crown. He was not sure if the city would forgive him, or if the Pax would embrace him as a brother, or brand him as a monster. He only knew that when he looked at Ilara, who had found her voice and her teeth, and now, somehow, her son's laugh nested within a memory she could hold, he understood the shape of the price he had chosen. Seraphine retreated from the cellar like an empress whose empire had cracked. She did not flee in defeat so much as recede with the promise of war in her eyes.
"You have not seen the last of House Voss," she said. "This ledger is longer than you imagine." Cain watched her go. He felt the wolf in his bones stir, curious and domestic at once. He looked back at Ilara, who sat with the moonstone at their feet like a relic they had reclaimed from sacrilege. "We are not safe," Ilara said, voice small but luminous. "But we are unbound." Cain reached for her hand, the gesture the simplest and most dangerous of all. His fingers brushed a new fur along his wrist where the moonstone had taken root and left its mark. He felt the calculus of his life shift towards something he had not budgeted for, a future that might be messy, hunted, and dangerous, but honest. "We will learn to be," he said. The word was a promise and a plan woven by someone who had been paid to be hard and had chosen to be tender anyway. Outside, the city did not stop its breathing. Pax muttered and gathered strategy like a tide. House Voss retreated into plotting. But beneath the estate's stones, a queen once caged, and the man who had set her free, sat with a stolen stone and a new kind of hunger. And the moon over the city slid towards its next inevitable phase. They did not go immediately. The Voss estate still smelled of iron and the perfume of old bargains. The servants moved like ghosts, brushing the edges of a life that no longer fit the house. Cain and Ilara gathered what little they could carry, not out of practicality, but to claim the shape of a life they planned to ruin and reassemble. Wren wrapped his arm around a satchel and fed them the few routes the Pax had kept friendly, old roads that ran along riverbeds and under bridges, places where treaties were whispered rather than signed. He would not come with them. Some debts needed repaying. He would wait and watch. His eyes, always too sharp for comfort, softened when he said, "You did good, Cain. You did the one thing I never thought I'd see you do." Outside, the moon rode low and forgiving. It painted light across the broken gate like a benediction. The city's glass towers reflected a cold, indifferent sky, but the alleyways hummed with a different energy now. Rumors seeded into action, alliances forming in the shadows, Pax recalibrating their maps. House Voss would strike back. Cain knew that. They would press until someone bled enough to be quiet again. But danger, he'd learned, could be kept honest. It could be met with hands that were capable of both murder and mercy. They left through the servants' entrance where ivy claimed old stone and where the estate's magic failed to reach. Ilara walked with a limp, bruises like constellations along her wrists, and a new, strange warmth braided into Cain's bones where the moonstone had sunk its teeth. No one else saw the subtle fur darkening along his forearm, or the way his breath hitched when wind lifted it, like an answering scent. He did not mind.
To be marked was to be human in a way Seraphine had never permitted. Their first shelter was a cheap room above a tavern that did not ask questions if you paid in favors. Ilara sat by the window with her feet tucked under her, and Cain watched the city roll by, its lights, its sinners, its saints. She hummed, a tentative thread of the lullaby that had once been a map to a child. Sometimes the melody wound into silence, then unfurled again, stronger. He kept his hand on her knee as if claiming geography, an acknowledgement that they were both present, both flawed, both willing to be held. They spoke of small things, maps, names of rivers, the lonely hope of finding a child's laugh again. They spoke in plans that were not grand strategy, but stubborn acts. A message sent to a beta who still remembered Ilara's favors. A night watch rota with Ren, a ledger of non-economic value where they would mark days alive and acts of kindness measured in spoonfuls of porridge. When Ilara finally laughed, full and surprised and almost ashamed, Cain felt the sound like a bell struck inside him. It was not a victory trumpet, it was something softer, the kind of laugh that seeds stubborn flowers in broken places. He kissed the top of her head, clumsy and reverent, and she let him, fingers curling around his wrist like an old anchor. "You gave me a name back," she said once, voice small, "not the one they kept in paper, but the one that mattered. You gave me a reason to stop counting only losses," he answered. They learned to be ordinary in little triumphs, patching wounds with stolen herbs, trading stories with children who didn't know what it meant to be a queen, listening for a laugh that might be true. Sometimes, late at night when the city quieted and the moon slid away into clouds, Cain would feel a pull in his ribs, an animal longing that was no longer a threat, but a new sort of belonging. Ilara would hum and he would hum back, two voices learning to tune each other. On the roof of the tavern, one evening when the moon showed itself like the thin coin it had been since the day they began, they sat wrapped in a blanket that smelled of smoke and bread. Beneath them, the city pulsed and breathed its dangerous, beautiful life. Ilara pressed her forehead to his shoulder and whispered, "We are unbound." Cain let the words settle into him like a seed. He did not know what the future would demand, blood or flight, bargains or forgiveness, but he felt, for the first time in years, that the ledger he carried could be rewritten in other ink, the ink of keeping, of choosing, of staying. When the moon rose full and washed the streets in silver, they did not hide. They did not promise a peace the world could not keep. Instead, they held each other steady on the ragged edge of a city that had taught them both how to survive and was only now learning how to love. The light painted them both fierce and tender, wolf-mark and queen wound, and for a fragile, stubborn second, the night offered them nothing to bargain for and everything to claim.